Hello, my name is Asia Clark, and I'm here to talk about Bill HR 5141, also known as Funding Early Childhood is the Right Idea Act. As an early intervention occupational therapist, I am very much so in favor of this bill, and that's why I'm so excited to talk about it today. This bill proposes for authorized increased funding based on improved outcomes as a result of the IDEA Act, specifically Parts B and C. Over the last 2 decades, funding has continued to be cut for these two sections, and this bill proposes for a gradual increase in funding over the next 5 years. I want to start by talking about the projected trajectory of this bill. The bill was introduced on August 4th of 2023, and right now is still under review. It was referred by Democratic Representative Mark DeSaulnier and currently has 19 Democratic co-sponsors and one Republican co-sponsor. It was referred to the House of Education and the Workforce Committee. Getting into the impact on occupational therapy. Under Part C of the IDEA Act, OTs are able to provide services in the child's natural environment. Increasing the funding for the program will continue to allow OTs to be able to provide these services to address occupations as they are tailored to that child and their specific environment. Decreased funding has also led to provider shortages, limiting access to occupational therapy services for all. Without this funding, the shortages may increase, and therefore there will be a reduction in the amount of therapists available to provide services to such a fragile community. To continue on the impact that this will have on OT, I think it's important to note that ultimately the goal of OT is to increase a child's competency and skills, ideally moving toward normative development. Increasing the funding can help occupational therapists provide this service to more children, lessening the gap for many of the children while they are young, being able to increase their success throughout life. I want to note that it's also important to discuss that best practices in early childhood programs typically circle around collaborative, family-centered, and responsive services to address the various needs. This is something that OTs that we value and that we really put our best foot forward on. And being able to have that extra funding to provide more services, to provide more therapists into these communities to help these children will be a great impact for not only our profession, but for the clients that we service as well. When discussing contextually meditative practices, they're essentially based in providing interest-based learning with daily family and community activities. As occupational therapists, all of our interventions are based on daily family and community activities. It's literally what we do. So being able to continue to thrive through early intervention and being able to provide these services through increased funding through this bill will be a great help to our profession. Next, I'd like to touch on the impact for consumers. So, unfortunately, if this bill is not passed, there will be less referrals for occupational therapy, and as a result, there will be less children receiving services to address the specific skills and needs that fall within the scope of occupational therapy. There will also be decreased access to services without this funding, and therefore less therapists are able to work for the program. In one of the articles that I was reading, it talked about how there was a conflict in how providers were referring for therapeutic services, and that there was some overlap between occupational therapy and developmental therapy. However, due to decreased funding, developmental therapists who do not require as much training and licensure as occupational therapists was being referred more often due to funding purposes, and therefore there was a decrease in meeting the needs that specifically occupational therapists do address. So I think that's really important for us to know, because that's an impact for not just the consumers, but the occupational therapists as well. I also want to highlight that this will specifically impact underserved communities who don't have financial means typically to pay for therapy out of pocket, or they don't have insurance that necessarily covers therapeutic services. Without this funding, a lot of those underserved communities that really truly need the services won't have access to them. So next, I want to talk about the role of OT in this. So When I'm talking about advocacy, the first thing that comes to mind is that we have to educate our stakeholders. So, being able to provide clear and concise information about the positive impact of early intervention services on children's development and the importance of the IDEA Part C funding. We are able to share success stories, research findings, and data that will highlight the benefit of these services and therefore tell them the importance of the funding and how that funding will impact continuing these services. Another role of OT in the advocacy department is building alliances. So being able to collaborate with parents, advocacy groups, educators, and just other professionals to form a united front in support of increased funding. A really diverse coalition can be more influential than just occupational therapists in conveying the importance of IDEA Part C to policymakers. At the end of the day, early intervention encompasses a lot of different specialties. And by building those alliances with all of those different specialties and the parents and the community, we'll be able to come in numbers, and numbers usually get results. Next, a very important part is also engaging with the policymakers. So being able to schedule meetings with our local, state, and federal policymakers to discuss the significance of IDEA Part C funding. We will have to be able to clearly articulate the positive outcomes associated with early intervention, which isn't hard to do, and emphasize the long-term benefits for both children and the community. Lastly, when I'm talking about my advocacy, I want to say that we can provide testimonials. As occupational therapists, we are on the ground. We are the ones working with these children, working with these families. And so being able to encourage the parents, the caregivers, and other professionals to share their personal experiences and testimonials regarding the positive impact of early intervention services can be a game changer. These personal stories can be compelling and can resonate with the different policymakers. I want to close this out by talking about the role of OT and the ethical considerations. The first ethical consideration I want to address is equity and access. So, equity and access essentially is about ensuring that increased funding benefits a diverse range of children with disabilities and promotes equal access to quality early intervention services without discrimination. We're getting this increased funding, but we want to make sure that it's spread across the nation and not just in certain parts or certain demographics. Accountability is another big part of ethical considerations, and just ensuring that there's accountability in the use of the funds by monitoring and evaluating the effectiveness of the programs, the services, and the interventions, making adjustments as needed to optimize outcomes for the children. Next, I want to discuss sustainability. So, there's a large increase that this bill proposes over the next 5 years. So striving for sustainable solutions that consider the long-term impact of increased funding on the overall system. Making sure that we're fostering stability and continuity in early intervention services. We don't want to put a whole bunch of money into the early intervention services and then it gets snatched away. We want to make sure that we're able to sustain the increase in funding, to sustain those results and sustain the help to the communities that we're serving. Collaboration and communication is also a large piece in the ethical considerations. And we just want to make sure that we're promoting collaboration among stakeholders and maintaining clear communication channels to facilitate a collective understanding of ethical considerations and decisions related to increased funding. And lastly, and my favorite, cultural competence or cultural responsibility, which is my preferred term. I think that recognizing and respecting the cultural diversity of the children and the families served by IDEA Part C and B, and incorporating cultural responsibility into our service delivery and advocating for culturally responsive practices is going to be a game changer, especially as it comes to increasing the funding, because that is a lot of the children that we serve. They fall in these underserved communities who are typically culturally diverse. So that was my presentation. I hope that you all enjoyed it. I hope that you learned more about the bill. These are the references that I have. And thank you so much for listening. Have a great day.